Those of you who were here the last time I spoke know that I'm ever the teacher. Always, once a teacher, always a teacher. Good morning, Glendale City Church. It is so good to be with you today. How are you doing? I would always ask my students every time I taught this question, how's your courage? And I know many of them, what do you mean by that? Well, we all are always in different places with our courage. And hopefully this, what I'm sharing with you today, will help you, especially if your courage may be needing a little boost. So, and choir, thank you so much for the beautiful music. It was just a perfect intro to this sermon. Perfect. And Teoshin, I'm not sure where you are, but the scripture reading was done beautifully, absolutely beautifully. Oh, there she is. I see. Thank you, Glenda. I see you. Before I begin my talk on the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, I need to share a few incidents from my life to set you up properly to understand my engagement with this parable. Those of you who heard me speak 2 years ago may remember that I shared with you that my first marriage ended abruptly, suddenly, when my children were 10 and 12 years old. It was a total and complete shock to me. And suddenly I was faced with the challenges of being a single parent. And I know I am not the only one in this room who has experienced that, either as an adult or as a child growing up in the home of a single parent household. In addition to having to earn the money, bring in the bread, so to speak, the paycheck to pay all the bills, the mortgage, I also was responsible for the laundry, the cleaning, the cooking, the car maintenance, the yard work, the tax preparation, bill paying, accounting. It went on and on and on, and instead of being in a fairly regular pace of life, I found myself more and more in the race of life. And then things got really interesting when my daughter went to academy, and all of a sudden the expenses, by the way, she attended right here at Glendale Academy, and all of a sudden the expenses just seemed to go like this: increased tuition, increased cost, but my salary was saying like this. And so how did I handle that? I started working overtime, so to speak. In addition to my regular load responsibilities, I started teaching almost 50% more hours during the semesters and also intersessions, sort of like summer school, winter and summer intersessions, just trying to make ends meet. And it was relentless, exhausting. I recognized that I needed to change how I was doing life. I could not even eat regularly as I had been. There really wasn't time for meals, so to speak. I had to fuel. And so I remember getting a big Ninja blender, and I'd cook a big pot of baby carrots once a week. And every morning, I'd throw some cooked baby carrots, some raw spinach, some Greek yogurt, some protein powder, some fiber, some Costco mixed berry blend, and a banana, along with some water to kind of add a little bit of liquidity to it, and blend it all up in that Ninja blender. It always came out looking light brown with a slightly purple tinge from the berries. And I would stand there over the sink in case there was a mess or a spill, and drink that, usually 2 full glasses plus a little bit more. And with everything that I put in, it could keep me going through most of the day into the evening, where I could have a quick bowl of cereal, again standing over the sink so there would be no mess, and fall into bed. And well, actually I'd stay up late, midnight 1, and then fall into bed and start the next day and repeat. During this time, right, it's going on like this for years. Oh, and I should mention to you before I move on, this story that I just shared reveals 2 things to you. 1, I am not a gourmet cook. And 2, I had amazing blood work all through that time that I was eating like this. My blood glucose levels, my cholesterol, my lipid panel, everything was spot on perfect while I was eating like this. I'll never have blood work like that again, ever. So a couple years into this, I remember being at a Hallmark card store, and I was picking out a greeting card, standing in line to pay for the card, and ahead of me was a tall man, broad shoulders, with hands that looked like they knew their way around a hammer and construction tools. And in his hand was a card. He was tall, but I am tall too. And I could see over his shoulder that he was holding a beautiful birthday greeting card for his wife. And all of a sudden, as I looked at him ahead of me with that card, this immense wave of longing welled up inside of me, a remembrance of when a spouse would get me a card like that, a wonder whether that would ever happen again, and just this overwhelming fatigue of what my life looked like now. And as I stood there, this strong desire rose in me to just take a step forward, put my hand on the back of this man, and just lean into him for a minute and feel the strength of shoulders bigger than mine and arms stronger than mine. That desire was there and very strong, but impulse control is essential in life. It absolutely is. And I could see, even in the midst of that desire, that acting upon it was not a good idea, would not at all bring me any satisfactory results. I contained and suppressed the desire, but I remember to this day how strong it was. I don't want you to think that it was just all, grim, grinding work. Somewhere, several years into this, I had the strong desire to take a waltz class. I loved the waltz. From the time I was a little girl, watching people do the waltz just was captivating for me. So I decided, okay, I need a bit of a spot of sunshine in my life. I'm going to take a waltz class. I'm single. When you go to the class, there are other single people and couples, and you essentially take turns rotating with partners as you learn the steps of the waltz. My memory was that mostly it was stumbling, stepping on and being stepped on because there are other beginners as we try to learn the waltz. But one day, the owner of the studio, a master dancer, came to the class. And he was going to teach us some of these steps and help us, encourage us, I think, to keep trying in this awkward beginning process. So he took turns waltzing with each one of us for just a few minutes. I'll never forget when it was my turn. He put his right hand behind my back and straightened my spine up, which pulled my shoulders back and opened me up. It almost hurt because I wasn't used to standing so straight. And then he took my right hand with his left, with the proper pressure, my arm on his shoulder, and we began doing the waltz, set in 1, 2, 3 time. And I can close my eyes and remember that experience. I had never really waltzed before, but for those minutes in this master's hold, I found myself moving through the waltz, a dance of such beauty, rise and fall, elegance, and grace. And it was only for a few minutes that I was able to have this experience, the only time that I felt like I truly waltzed. My rotation was over, the class ended, and shortly after that, life happened, and I just had to stop taking classes and move on to the responsibilities of my world. Now, you may wonder why I shared these stories with you. I promise you I will reference them as we go through the sermon. It was my habit, and it still is, every night before I went to bed to read a bit of scripture. At this particular time, one particular time in my life, I was in the book of Matthew, and I came to chapter 20, where our story today begins, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And when I opened up Matthew and saw that, late at night, I said to the Lord, I don't want to read this story. And I almost pulled the single mom card. I'm tired. I didn't really understand or like this parable, and I didn't want to tackle it late at night. But God is God, and I am not. And I felt him strongly impressing me that I needed to go ahead and move through the story. And so I began to read it. Teoshin did a beautiful job of reading the scripture. I'm not going to do it again, but I will summarize some high points. First of all, it's important to realize that at that particular time, a standard workday was not 8 hours, but 12 hours, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And the usual customary day's wage was 1 denarius. So this story begins with the landowner going out at 6 a.m. in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He meets with some workers, agrees to pay them a denarius, and off they go to work in his vineyard. Then it says that he comes back at 9 a.m., hires some more workers, and says he'll pay them whatever is right. Off they go to work in his vineyard. He does the same thing at 12 noon and 3 p.m. And finally, at 5 p.m., with only 1 hour left in the workday, he goes to the marketplace, hires some more workers, and they go to the vineyard. At 6 p.m., he tells his manager to pay the workers their wage for the day, beginning with the ones hired last at 5 p.m. and going on to the ones hired first. He pays the men who were hired at 5 p.m., who worked only 1 hour, a denarius. 1 denarius. He also pays the men who were hired at 6 a.m., who worked 12 hours through the heat of the day, 1 denarius. And they were upset. They grumbled and complained. They went to the landowner, and they said something similar to what I probably would have said. You have made the men who worked only 1 hour equal to those of us who have borne the burden of the work through the heat of the day. They were upset and angry. And at this particular point in the story, I stopped reading. Please tell me I'm not alone here in being frustrated to have worked 12 hours out in the field, and that's hard work. I do yard work, often have been blistered by the end of the day. They worked 12 hours out in the vineyard, and they got the same pay as the men who worked only 1. Didn't understand the story. And in my fatigue and exhaustion, my frustration just openly, honestly spilled out to God. I don't understand this story. I have never understood the story. Why did the landowners pay? And by the way, landowners, I know that's you, God. I know the landowner represents you in this story. Why did the landowner pay the men who worked only 1 hour, the same as the men who worked 12? And God answered me clearly, succinctly, deliberately. He answered me and said, because they waited. And in that moment, I immediately felt myself being taken up in the spiritual hold of God. He straightened my back, expanded my shoulders, put proper glasses on me so that I could move with him through the beauty and the grace of this story that I had never been able to see before. Right? I got what God was trying to say to me, right? These men who were hired at 5 p.m., they had been standing out there all day long, all day long. And he reminded me of some experiences that I had had earlier in my life that I had forgotten. He reminded me of a work colleague that I had who told me a story of doing a yard landscape project and needing workers. And so she went to Home Depot to hire day laborers. She anticipated a language barrier. And so she did not intend to interview any of them to see which ones she would hire. Instead, she just pulled up, indicated the number of workers that she needed, and figured that the men who jumped in the back of her truck fast enough were the ones who wanted the work the most. Then she told me about how hard these men worked all day long, and with a congratulatory attitude told me how little she had to pay them. I remember my feelings of frustration at hearing her describe the compensation she gave these men. It did not seem to me, by her own reckoning of events, that she gave them a fair day's wage for a full day's work. Then God steered my mind to my commute to PCC every morning, where I taught chemistry. I often had to get off the 210 freeway because it was jammed and take Colorado west to PCC. It passed right by a Dunn Edwards paint store, and I remember every time I passed it, I would see day laborers standing out in front of the Dunn Edwards. And I had to resist the urge to just pull into the parking lot and say, "Come on, fellas, let's go paint PCC." They were not sure whether they were going to work that day, but I was sure I was going to work. They were not sure if they were going to get paid, but I was sure I was. And I felt the pressure that they were under. I recognized the inequities of life. Children are not born into a level playing field with the same stability, the same resources, the same opportunities. And they don't live their life out as adults. We don't live our life out as adults in a level playing field either. And I have struggled with the inequities of life then, and I still do now. Finally, God took my mind to the men who were hired at 5 p.m. As I said, they had stood there all day long. The landowner noticed them. How do we know that? Because the parable says so. He comes to the marketplace at 5 p.m. and says to them, "Why have you been standing here idle all day?" But they were not lazy, shiftless idlers. They were willing to work. How do we know that? Because they said so. They answered the landowner and said, "Because no one has hired us." So why did they stand there all day long? And what I had never been able to see clearly before, I immediately understood now. Because they needed the money. Because if they couldn't get hired for a full day's pay, then maybe they could get hired for a half day's pay, or maybe 3 hours pay, or at the very least 1 hour of pay, so that if they came home at the end of the day and their children greeted them and said, "Daddy, did you work today?" he could say, "Yes, my dears, I did. There's money to put food on the table. tonight. There's money to put food on the table tonight. Then I could recognize that what this story is really doing is contrasting the generosity and kindness of God's heart with the brokenness and pettiness of our own. The landowner could see that these men were waiting all day long. He knew how difficult and hard it is to wait with uncertainty, that is more depleting and exhausting than working hard with certainty for a guaranteed outcome. In other words, repeating, waiting is more for an uncertain outcome is more depleting and exhausting than working hard for a certain one. He saw that. He recognized the challenges they were facing. And with compassion and kindness, he paid them a denarius, a full day's wage for only 1 hour of work because they waited. Now let's contrast the landowner, God's attitude, with the attitude of the men hired at 6 a.m. They could not be happy for their fellow laborers who unexpectedly and delightedly got a denarius for only 1 hour work. They could not be happy, even though they all knew each other and they all had experience in the marketplace waiting for a job. They all knew the capriciousness of the hiring process, the luck of the draw of who got hired and who didn't. And they all knew the futility and disappointment of waiting all day long to get hired and going home empty-handed. Still, they could not be happy that the landowner leveled the playing field, so to speak, addressed the inherent inequities of the hiring process by giving everyone the same wage at the end of the day because they waited. And then I immediately realized, why did God lead me to this story at this season of my life? And I understood why. He knew I was struggling with the inequities in my own life, with the lack of fairness and justice. I did not by myself bring 2 children into this world. I did not by myself acquire a mortgage to put a roof over their head. But here I was trying to parent them and keep them housed, pay that mortgage all by myself. And I was beginning to sink under the process. My courage, remember what I asked you? How's your courage at the beginning? I was losing my courage. And God was saying to me, I see you, Debbie. I see you. He sees me. He sees you in your circumstances, whatever it is you're facing. He sees us all. And he is saying to us, if you will wait for me, if you will wait on me, I will make it right. I will wipe away your tears and fill your heart's desire if you wait for me. Now, science is the process of asking a good question. And it's important to stop and consider, why is there injustice and inequity lack of fairness to begin with? And why does God allow that? That's a good question. That's a great question. I think that's one of the most important questions that each one of us has to wrestle with in our own life story. And God is God, and I am not, as I said earlier. The answer to that question is beyond my pay grade. And I personally don't believe it lies in any simple didactic explanation. But the story itself gives us an important clue to that answer. The men who were hired at 6 a.m., who got exactly what they wanted that day, a full day's work at a fair day's wage, left at the end of the day feeling angry and disgruntled. But the men who waited, who stood there through the long, hot hours, waiting, wondering, worrying, were they going to get any pay? Were they going to bring anything home to their families? Those were the men who were, at the end of the day, leaving with delighted ecstasy because the landowner had seen them and poured out his kindness and compassion into them by giving them a full day's wage. I never would have chosen the road I've walked in this world. Never. But I would not give up what I've learned about God as a result of walking it. How he has poured out into my life his kindness and his compassion. And an example of that is my dear husband, Joe. And I don't know if you were upstairs, downstairs, I'm not sure where you are, Joe, but I know that you know him, Joe Martinson. I want to say to you, I see you, Joe. There's a bright light right here, and so it's kind of masking you, but I see you in the balcony. I want to tell you, Joe, that you were worth waiting 17 years for. I want you to know that. And I am so very grateful that you weren't alarmed when I told you that the kitchen appliance I felt most at home with was a blender. I'm so glad that God inspired you to look me up. And these last 10 years have been some of the happiest of my life. Thank you, Joe, for that. The story of the laborers in the vineyard ends with this: the last will be first, and the first will be last. And I've pondered about that meaning. What does that phrase mean? The last will be first, and the first will be last. Clearly, it's trying to challenge our hierarchical, linear thinking. Who's on the top? Who's on the bottom? Who's winning? Who's not winning? The comparative judgments we make every day with each other about looks, about strength, about riches, about power, about position, about influence and connections. The comparisons are made constantly, and whenever there is comparisons, there's competition. All of us knows what it's like to feel the pain of coming in last in something, being on the losing end of the game. We all carry the scars from that. And what Jesus is trying to say in this parable is that that's not what the kingdom of God is like. It's not linear. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. It's circular. That's what it's saying to me. It's circular. And as soon as I realized that, then all of a sudden, this image came to my mind. I know God inspired it to help me tie together all of the pieces of this story. Now, I inform my class that an artist I am not. So you're going to bear with me as I try to draw up here what I'm seeing. There are three major actions that are represented in this story that we're told about. Working. And I don't know, those of you up in the balcony, are you able to see that? And if you can't, I'll describe it. It's really the shape, even more than the words, that in the end is most critical. And those of you in the balcony, I remember you're there. I will deal with the challenge of you not being able to see through before I'm finished. All right, so there's the action of working. There's the action of waiting that we've talked about. And there's one other action. It's very subtle. It's right at the very beginning of the parable when Jesus begins by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. Why did he tell this parable? Because he's trying to direct our understanding to who God is, his compassion, his generosity, his grace, so that we can perceive that. And in perceiving that, it calls forth spontaneously our worship and our praise. So worship is the third major action in this story. And as I said, the last will be first and the first will be last, right? It's not linear. Kingdom of heaven is not linear. It's not comparative. It's not competitive. It's circular. And what drives this, it's not just circular, it's a wheel. It moves. There is another action that is mentioned in the story. And that is the action of receiving. And as we receive from the landowner in the story, from God, it fuels all of these three major pieces of our life: our work, our waiting, and our worship. All of that is fueled by our receiving. And it goes both ways. The more we worship, the more we receive to worship, the better we are able to receive itself. It goes both ways. The more we wait, the more we receive from God to wait, the better we are able to receive from God to wait even more, and especially in the difficult season. The more we work, the greater our capacity to receive from God and to work even more. And of course, what ties this all together in a circle? The Spirit. And it's a wheel, not just a circle, but a wheel. And it's moving. And it's moving on a specific path. This is the hardest part of the drawing for me. So bear with me while I draw it. That red is kind of tired. I've got a tired marker. Let's see if this one is better. Yeah, this one's better. Okay, can you see what I've drawn here? It's not great, but can you recognize the image? What's the wheel moving on? It's moving on a cross. Jesus told us that. Whoever would come after me must take up his cross and follow me. He says it again in John 14. I am the way, in that I am truth, and I am life. And where is this path taking us? Where are we going with this? We are going where? We're going to heaven, or my favorite word for heaven. We're going where? We're going home. That's where my Father is. So this drawing here is really the model of my life. It is what fuels my story. It is what powers my courage, not only when it's easy, but also when it's hard. And let me just stop here. I promised you, choir, that I would not forget. So here we go. So you see the wheel, the working, the waiting, the worship, the movement forward on the cross, and where it's heading. I just said that this is my foundation point, my anchor point. The story I shared with you happened almost 20 years ago, and I have not forgotten. And it helps me make forward progress, not only when it's easy, but also when it's hard. Last December 4, I was with Joe. We were in Orlando, Florida, because my daughter just gave birth to a baby. And we were on a brief little trip to St. Augustine to catch a break and see the lights. We were walking around outside around 6 p.m. It was dark, Christmas lights twinkling, and there's a call from my son. He's calling from a hospital where he and his wife were at. Their baby boy had been put down for a nap at daycare. And when the daycare provider went to wake him up, he was unresponsive. Immediately, medical attention was given. He was raced to the hospital. Everything was done to try to save his life. But it could not be saved. And my son was calling me to tell me the news. He and his wife were with their baby boy, with his lifeless body, saying goodbye to him. I immediately started sobbing. Joe, you held me in your arms while I cried so loudly on a bench located on the street that strangers who were there to see the Christmas lights stopped and put their hand on my shoulder, not knowing what was wrong, but clearly understanding it was very bad. And this is the hardest part of this sermon for me, to go to my grief over that experience and not get lost in it. And the only reason I'm doing it is because I know I'm not alone. I see your faces. I see the look on your faces. Each and every one of us knows that grief. I don't understand why Henry was taken from us. In 2 days, he would have been 9 months old. But I do understand that there is a God who loves him and who loves me. And I hear him saying to me, wait for me, Debbie. If you could trust that I brought Henry to you, you can trust that I am keeping him for you, even through death. Wait for me. And I'm waiting. I'm waiting one day my faith will be my sight, and I will see him again. And in the meantime, I find myself doing what I would not do so long ago in that Hallmark store. Joe, your arms are so strong and steady for me, but not even your arms are strong enough for the grief that I've walked through this entire year. We're coming up on his 1-year anniversary. So when I am overwhelmed, I know exactly what to do. I just lean in. I lean in on shoulders that are broader than mine and the everlasting arms that are under mine. I know, God knows, that pain and that suffering. I know he does. He lost his own son on the cross, but he raised him, and he's going to raise ours. And just a little note of encouragement, my son Adam and his wife Corinne are expecting another child, a baby boy. He's not going to replace Henry, but he will comfort them in their loss over their son. And he's due December 3rd. So we're praying for that. And when you see in the Day of Remembrance that's coming up in November his name, Henry Wood, you'll know a little bit more about this background to his name. Before I close, I just want to mention one more thing that ties in what we're going to do here today. This model of waiting, working, worshiping reaches its full expression right here, right now in this church. Church is the one place where we find the fullness and completeness of this story, where all of our working, our waiting, and our worshiping comes to its fullness and completeness. The church is the body of Christ, and as Ephesians so beautifully says, the church is the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. And I'm so grateful to be here with you today, engaging in this worship service. So grateful, Pastor Uriel, for the opportunity. So grateful to you, choir. I can't sing like you sing, but you help me worship when I hear you sing. Right? I know I'm going home. And when I am home, the thing I want most will be mine. A heart that beats like God. That's what I want most. A heart that beats with the same generosity and love and compassion as God's heart. And then I will be able to fully see him and know him as he fully knows me. And we will be one forevermore. Thank you.